But my name is Ben Wofford. I'm a senior here at Brown. I'm one of the editors-in-chief of the Brown Political Review, and it's such a treat and an incredible privilege to be in the presence of our incredible panel today. But before I tell you a little bit more about our speakers, I just wanted to briefly tell you a little bit more about us, who we are, why we invited this panel, and what we do. Brown Political Review was founded just last year on the idea that there's a space at Brown to support excellent student journalism, as well as political commentary covering issues of every topic, every geography, and every ideology under the sun. We found a sponsor with the Political Theory Project, without whose support we could not exist, and we started last year with a core staff of 40 students. We started a website, and we crossed our fingers. 1 year later, our magazine has nearly doubled. Our website showcases new content every day, including our first ever media productions this semester, which you'll find online this week. And our staff has expanded to nearly 100 undergraduates as well as graduate students. We have staff involved in every aspect of magazine production, and BPR alumni have gone on to pursue these dual interests in journalism and politics with the same passion that they devote to our magazine here at Brown, going on to work at CBS, NPR, the Huffington Post, as well as the Governor of Rhode Island, the Chamber of Commerce, the White House, among other places. So today is sort of a 1 year anniversary for us, and I just hope that as we're also lucky to listen to our panel engage this incredibly important topic about whether journalism can thrive in this new era, that we sort of might think to ourselves, what can we do about it? What comes next? And what can I do to support college initiatives to get passionate students into the game and maybe just maybe take up this torch as we consider that all of our panelists today are all alumni from Brown. So please consider supporting this expanding but fragile project. You can buy a subscription at the door. You can talk to our business director about advertising. You could even make a small donation, or even just reading our website and telling people you know in your family. Anything that you can do is a direct down payment to supporting this project and student journalism here at Brown. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Professor Tracy Breton. Professor Breton is a magna cum laude graduate of Syracuse University, where she earned simultaneous degrees in journalism and political science in 1973. Afterwards, she joined the Providence Journal and quickly cultivated a role as a nationwide leader in investigative reporting, focusing on legal matters in the courts. For a series of stories that Professor Breton exposed, in the series of stories, she exposed corruption in the Rhode Island court system. And these stories led to the resignation and conviction of the state's Chief Justice and his top administrator. And for that story, Professor Breton shared the Pulitzer Prize in 1994. In 2006, Breton was one of just 10 journalists in the United States selected for a Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism. Since 1997, Breton has taught as visiting professor of journalism in the English department's nonfiction writing program, where I can personally attest that her journalistic writing class is widely regarded as one of the unmissables, quote unquote, a class that no Brown student can graduate without taking. After decades of serving the citizenry of the state of Rhode Island and the Brown community, Professor Breton ended her 40-year career with the Providence Journal, retiring just last week. She continues to teach and is currently working on an upcoming book project. Please join me in welcoming both Professor Breton and our incredible panel. We're so lucky to have them.
Thank you, Ben, for your nice remarks, and to you and all of the wonderful students here working with you for the Brown Political Review who put together this event. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for coming to what I anticipate will be a very informative and thought-provoking panel. The format of the panel will have me posing questions to each of our guests here for about 45 minutes. After that, the floor will be open to members of our audience who will be allowed to ask their own questions. I ask that when that part of the event begins, that those with questions please line up at the microphones that have been set up so that everyone can hear you. Now I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. My good friend David Rohde is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who currently works as a foreign affairs columnist for Thomson Reuters. Previously, he reported for the New York Times for 15 years, and before that for ABC News, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Christian Science Monitor. David has built a reputation as a fearless reporter who made investigative forays into conflict zones, places in the world where many journalists would not dare tread. It was at the Christian Science Monitor that David won his first Pulitzer in 1995 for foreign reporting. The award was for a series of stories he wrote that helped expose the mass execution of 7,000 Bosnian Muslims at Srebrenica. He was part of an 8-member team of reporters who in 2009 shared a Pulitzer for foreign reporting for their coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan. He spent 7 months and 10 days in captivity in those two countries after being captured by the Taliban. He won his freedom after planning and executing a daring escape. David Rhode is the author of 3 books, A Rope and a Prayer, The Story of a Kidnapping, Endgame, The Betrayal and Fall of Srebrenica, and most recently, Beyond War, Reimagining American Influence in a New Middle East. A history concentrator, he graduated from Brown in 1990. Chris Hayes is the primetime host of All In with Chris Hayes on MSNBC and editor-at-large of The Nation. From 2010 to 2011, he was a fellow at Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Foundation for Ethics, and from 2008 to 2009 was a Bernard Schwartz Fellow at the New American Foundation. Earlier in his career, he also was a Schumann Center Writing Fellow at In These Times. For more than a decade, Chris has written about political culture and political economy. His essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Time, The Nation, The American Prospect, The New Republic, The Washington Monthly, The Guardian, and The Chicago Reader. His book about the crisis of authority in American life, Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy, was published by Crown in June 2012. He graduated from Brown in 2001 with a BA in philosophy. Dana Goldstein is a journalist who writes about education, politics, women's issues, cities, and public health. A Schwartz Fellow at the New American Foundation and a Puffin Fellow at the Nation Institute, Dana is now working on a book about the political history of public school teaching in America. She previously served as associate editor at the Daily Beast and the American Prospect. She graduated from Brown in 2006 with a concentration in history. Please welcome our panelists. Okay. Study after study shows that our political process, from legislative logjam to campaign spending to the tone of our public debate, is more polarized than at any time in recent history, possibly since the Civil War. Is this polarized atmosphere affecting the way journalism functions? Chris, you want to start?
Yes, I think unmistakably it is. I think I have a lot of complicated and cross-pressured thoughts on this, but let me lay out a few things. One is that we have to be very careful about asserting a kind of natural state of journalism from which we have diverted. Objective journalism, as we think of it, was essentially a marketplace invention. It was a marketplace invention because certain newspaper owners figured out that they would have a better time selling to more people if they didn't offend one side of the political spectrum. And so everything that we think of as the norm, which is a period of time of about 60 years in the history of particularly written journalism in this country, 80 years maybe tops, is actually a historical anomaly in the history particularly of Western journalism, in the history of journalism in the English language, in the history of American journalism. The period of sort of objective journalism is an anomaly. It's also the case that the particularities of American polarization as a political phenomenon, both represented in Congress, represented in public opinion data, and represented in the workings of the American system of government, was also anomalously non-polarized during that same period of time. So there's a whole lot of things about the period of time that we think of as the norm that in a historical perspective are actually quite anomalous. I think what ends up happening in this discussion around polarization, particularly polarization in journalism, is we end up with this kind of false forced choice in which everything has to be either AP wire copy or Fox News, right? It's either incredibly bombastic and partisan and sort of agenda driven, or it is neutral and objective. And the fact of the matter is, most journalism that has existed since the form took shape existed somewhere between those two poles. I think most of my life as a journalist has existed between those two poles. The magazine that I wrote for, The Nation magazine, was founded in 1865 by abolitionists who shockingly had an agenda. Happened to be, I think a pretty good one, actually. And in fact, I think it would look somewhat preposterous to look back at journalism that was neutral between slavery and abolitionist slavery, right? The Nation magazine had an explicit agenda, which was this sort of abolitionist agenda, and it's had an agenda throughout its life. It has also produced incredibly good journalism. And I think that the dangers of the polarization we see is the temptation to do journalism that does nothing but feed to the confirmation bias that is embedded in the audience you are speaking to. And I say this as someone who has to deal with that temptation every day of my life. Every day I wake up, yesterday is a perfect example. We had been covering the shutdown for 16 days, and man, had I been kicking the ass out of the Republicans. And I was kicking the ass out of the Republicans because, well, that's an easy applause line. So that's a perfect example, right? That's performing precisely what I mean. So, been kicking out the ass of the Republicans because I thought they were wrong, and it wasn't like some performance. Like, I really was angry about what they were doing. Yesterday I came to the editorial meeting, I said, I don't care if everyone turns off the TV set. We are leading the show tonight with Obamacare being a real, what's the right word to say in polite company?
Disappointment.
Mess. And that was actually, we talked in the editorial meeting, and I'm thinking about the viewer that's come home and worked all day and has put their kid to bed and is having a beer and could be watching The Voice or watching the Boston Red Sox or watching something else and is mentally exhausted and is a liberal and wants to believe in the president and wants to believe in the success of the Affordable Care Act and sitting down, and up comes my show and they're sitting there with their remote and I'm like, dude, Obamacare. It's not been a good 3 weeks. And it's like, click. So, all of that to say is the increasing polarization of having just defended kind of opinion journalism, I will also say that the increasing polarization of American political life and audiences and the balkanization thereof does create some perverse incentives that one has to patrol against, because from a market and ratings perspective, it probably was not the smartest choice for me to lead my show last night with problems in Obamacare. But you have to combine some kind of fidelity to some sort of journalistic ethos with some kind of set of core principles you're pursuing, and then also the market incentive of trying to get people to watch what you do or read what you write.
I think I mostly cover education and public schools. And for me, one of the exciting things about that topic is there's an incredibly fertile debate within each party on the issues around things like teachers' unions, charter schools. So it's very exciting for me to cover education within this landscape because it's not as stale of a debate with as predictable positions as some other issues. I started my career in 2006 at a small progressive magazine, The American Prospect, down in Washington, covering more of like a general political landscape. And then after 4 years, I moved to New York and I started to focus in a little bit more on education. And I would say that my friends that are still living in DC and covering things like Congress and the White House, I hear a lot of expressions of disgruntlement about how frustrating it is to be covering that stuff day to day. So for me, sort of finding a policy specialization and getting deeper expertise was a way to make it more satisfying, a more satisfying job.
I'm the sort of dinosaur on this panel.
Not as much as me. No, I am. I think I am.
Yes, for the record, I was going to wait and be polite. I am sitting next to the most feared reporter in Rhode Island. I'm not kidding. And to defend newspapers and dinosaurs and newspaper reporting. No, I'm serious. People feared Tracy. She brought down a judge, as you heard. People were terrified of her and still are. And that's a public service for all of us. I think obviously the biggest, and I've now become a columnist, so I'm really all over the place. But there's a huge problem with Fox. It has to be countered. But I do see the collapse of the newspaper business model as a loss for the American public. It was false. It was a 40-year bubble. But we need some of that basic fact-based reporting. And things are getting worse and we'll talk about it more for the next hour and a half, but, and there is no such thing as a totally objective story, but trying to get out on the ground and just get, people's voices, facts, is a really valuable thing for the public. And it's very sad to me what's happened.
Well, so we're all talking about this problem that exists, and my question is, how can quality journalism, whether it's opinionated or more neutral reportage, thrive in this kind of environment? Anybody want to
There's
take
quality
a...
journalism on MSNBC.
Yeah.
There is, although let me just be, I feel deeply humbled to be up here with the folks that the two of you have done the kind of work you've done. And let me reiterate what you just said, which is, I don't think of you as dinosaurs, I think of you as sharks, right? Because, no, because sharks were around back then as well. They did survive. Right?
As long as we're not jellyfish,
you're not
right?
going extinct. Could have gone with ginkgo trees or cockroaches, but no. Well, I'm saying not.
That is very nice.
No, I mean, but the point being that, like, the kind of work that the two of you have done, and the kind of work you're talking about, and the kind of work that when I was very first coming up and writing for the Chicago Reader, I wasn't doing opinion journalism. I was doing kind of voicey feature magazine journalism that wasn't ideological journalism. And I was writing about, nothing like what you were doing, but I was writing about local corruption, stuff like that. I agree that stuff is just indispensable. And I think about journalism as a kind of ecosystem in which different kinds of creatures are doing different things, and they're all kind of related to each other in a food chain. And what happens if you remove one layer of that ecosystem, if you, deforest a habitat, you get all sorts of cascading effects that are really negative. And so, to me, in some ways, everyone in the journalistic ecosphere is kind of eating off of the people that are doing the first impression work. And yet there's the least amount of profit in the first impression work. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very perverse set of circumstances. What do I do every day? I have a note in the morning that is collated of stories that are out there that some other reporters did. And those other reporters are not making a lot of money, most of them, and I am essentially vampiric off that work. Now, we try to do our own reporting, we make our own calls, we run stuff down. But the danger right now is that this kind of ecosystem which we have in certain ways, which is really amazing, which has allowed a lot of different stuff to flourish, is going to cannibalize the first impression kind of work that you two have done and that I think you're talking about, and then the whole thing collapses in on itself. I
think it's important to say that there used to be a distinction in journalism between opinion writing on one hand and reporting on the other, and that's a false choice. There can be great reported opinion journalism. When I started my career after graduating from Brown in 2006, I feel really blessed that I did start at the American Prospect, because there I learned with this group of young people who were trying to bridge that divide. People like Josh Marshall, who went on to found Talking Points Memo, had started his career there. Ezra Klein, who's at the Washington Post, Matt Iglesias. So I was learning from these people who were not that much older than me, but had been at it for a few more years, and they were trying to break down this choice between just, I'm out there with my opinions and it's not backed by anything, versus objectivity. Objectivity is a process. It's impossible for a person to be objective. This is my opinion. But the process of objectivity, where you're calling people and hearing from people with many different viewpoints on an issue, is incredibly important. And I believe that, I hope in my work I'm still using objectivity as a process, although I did begin my career writing for progressive magazines. So I think I'm very, very actually optimistic. I think at 29, I've been able to do a whole wealth of things in journalism because of the internet that I never could have done in the first 8 years out of college 20 or 30 years ago. Because the thirst for content is so great. Now if you're working at a publication, you're being told to file. If you're 22 or 23, you're being told to file sometimes 5 to 8 times per day. So it's
mostly listicles.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's really exhausting and crazy, but compared to what people used to do in the first few years of a magazine career 30 years ago, it's a lot more satisfying than just being a full-time fact checker, running to get coffee, or things like that. I mean, I think one of the surprises for me is that a lot of my work over the past couple years has been funded by foundations, and that's an entirely sort of developing new model for getting serious journalism funded because the advertising base is falling away. And I think there's a whole new set of pressures that come in. One thing I'll just say about that is labor issues are something that I have focused on frequently in my career. And the sort of new funding base for progressive journalism, a lot of it's coming out of Silicon Valley or Wall Street funders who are Democrats, but they are not, labor issues are often sort of off the table. So I have found that I can have that discussion, but it involves, convincing people. But I have never felt any ideological pressure from the funders that I work with. But I think that there are perverse incentives that are possible with this model, just like there were with advertising.
The not nice term for the pressure to churn stuff out would be digital sweatshops.
Yeah.
They're tech and they're really sleek and they're often wealthy, liberals. And I've met, and it is, so if you're young, it's a real opportunity to get out there and get your work seen. And there are real opportunities out there, which is great. But then I've had young people complain about being tied to a desk. They don't want to post 5 or 8 times a day. They actually want to go out and cover a beat and do basic reporting and all this kind of stuff. And this is back to this economic pressure in the model. I think there's some kind of journalism that's never going to pay. I'm hopeful that the sort of nonprofit model, the work of ProPublica, I'm on the board of something called the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. They're a nonprofit that funds overseas reporting. There's dangers with the funders, the billionaires, the plutocrats deciding what you're going to write about, but that's a really exciting thing to me. ProPublica just spent, I think, $750,000 and 18 months on one long investigative story.
Right.
And that's never going to make money, but it's exciting that they exist and there is great stuff going out there. I don't want us to be sounding too negative here.
Okay, so by what metric should we evaluate journalism then? With all of this, I'm sorry, shout TV, as I would call it.
What are you talking about?
I knew that would get a rise out of you. There's a lot of mythologizing about a Cronkite figure, someone who can just tell it like it is. Is that an unrealistic standard at this point? Or even a gold standard even more?
Walter Cronkite was not Walter Cronkite when Walter Cronkite was alive, first of all. There has been a lot of mythologizing about Walter Cronkite afterwards, which is not to say Walter Cronkite wasn't a fantastic broadcaster. He was. But the Walter Cronkite was a byproduct of a certain set of economic and technological conditions, more than he was some kind of colossus, right? The reason so many people watched Walter Cronkite was because there were 3 networks, right? I was watching a Johnny Carson American Masters thing on Netflix the other night at 1 a.m. for reasons I don't know why. And, 45 million people watched Tiny Tim get married on The Tonight Show.
Yeah.
No one watches 45 million people don't watch anything anymore except for the Super Bowl. And that is because there were only 3 networks then, right? So the amount of choice there was at the moment that we think of this golden age was greatly reduced. The benefit that conferred on the American political conversation was that people were all essentially sitting around the same table. And there is a tremendous civic value to people kind of working off the same record. It's like in a courtroom, right? In an appeals court, where you're not trying the facts, right? Everyone's working off the same record, right? The facts are established and people are arguing the law. And the way that the old model worked, I think, where there's very constrained choices, right? Particularly in broadcast, and everyone's watching essentially the same thing, is kind of like that appellate court model. The facts are determined and people are arguing about their interpretation. But we don't live in that world anymore. I mean, we live in a world of much, much more choice. And there's negative consequences to that, but there's also positive consequences to that. there's an argument to be said that Cronkite came late to the realization the Vietnam War was a total disaster. And had there been a network out there that was a left network, they might have been pointing out far, far, far earlier that the Vietnam War was a disaster. They might have been pointing out at the moment of Tonkin that Tonkin was a mistake, right? But that didn't happen.
Wasn't that what the anti-war movement was all
They
about?
were, but they
Yeah.
didn't have a network. I mean, my point is that we lionize Cronkite because for the moment when he comes to the American people and says this war in Vietnam is a disaster, but had there been an alternative choice of a genuine left network at that time, it is entirely possible that they would have more successfully agitated against the war or shown the negative consequences of the war before Cronkite sort of came to this conclusion 5 or 6 years into U.S. involvement.
David, you want to weigh in on this one?
I just feel like the downside though is that we are more fragmented than ever. That the barrier, and this is, I will be scoffed at here. I know this is going to be a long day at Brown, but
No one's
there was, we talked about this earlier, that to publish a book, to get your voice out there, you had to, for better or worse, have ties to a network or a newspaper or a publisher. Now anyone can post anything, and let's be honest, a lot of the stuff that's on the web is not accurate or true. And there's no turning back. The web is fantastic, Twitter is fantastic, the more information the better, but I don't know how we make ourselves more cohesive. How we agree on those facts, because we're not listening to each other, we're talking past each other. And it's what happened for the last 16 days has never happened before. And yes, it's the fault of the House Republicans, but I believe that, Objectively, I totally
He's
agree.
an objective reporter.
That's right, objectively. But I also think that most of the people that are supporting them live in a world where they sincerely believe Barack Obama is destroying the United States. Some of them are racist and there's other issues, but they live in this bubble, where that is what they're told every single day. And that scares me. And they should watch MSNBC and read more widely and see experts. You've become sort of an expert in an area. That's another great thing that's happening in journalism. But that, it's not just that, we can dismiss them as kind of idiots or whatever, but they really believe, what they're hearing and seeing in that little bubble.
But I think Dana's work is kind of a useful model precisely here, because Dana reports on one that is essentially like, from where I sit, it's the Israel-Palestine of domestic politics. I mean, no, the education wars are nasty. They are intense. They're intensely partisan. They are, and it is really, there are two sets of facts. Anytime a new study comes out, immediately these sort of parallel machines start churning about, but I think the work you do, and I'm not just saying this because you're a friend and you're here, but singularly actually is the work that I seek out to try to kind of make sense across those two worlds, and there is a place for it. I think that you found a niche in which you are kind of attempting to do that, right?
Well, thanks. This summer I did a lot of reporting on Teach for America, which is highly controversial. And I got on the phone with the FLAC, the PR guy for Teach for America, and he said, I asked a bunch of people about you, and some people said you were a reformer, and some people said you weren't. And I was like, that's great. That's exactly how I want it to be. I think, like I said, because there's a huge debate within the Democratic Party about education and a huge debate within the Republican Party, it's a little easier as a journalist to sort of take a center path. But yeah, I advise all young journalists to build expertise, because I think it's the one skill that no one can ever take away from you.
But do people read the central path, the kind of reasoned thing? I mean, the bomb-throwing column, and this is where Chris deserves credit for attacking Obamacare last night. Meaning, for both of you. I just
reported on it.
Well, others would not, though. You can just.
But there's always been like a hard nativist right in this country. I mean, this is not the Tea Party is. This Tea Party stuff has a long historical lineage. So I just think I want to be careful about not thinking that the time we're in now is so unique. I mean, I actually feel that as a reader who loves consuming great journalism, I am so glad to be living in 2013, because there is just an overwhelming amount of wonderful stuff out there. The problem is making it pay and making these careers sustainable for people. But the fact that about 1/3 of this country is on the hard evidence-free right, I don't think that's actually a new phenomenon.
Can I make a distinction here? I think there's a really important distinction you made about between production and consumption. Because actually, in some ways, it's a sort of best of times, worst of times story. On the production side, I think it's a best of times story. Like, if you want to find things out, there has never been, at a certain level, more stuff. Now, there's certain areas that are getting kind of hollowed out, which in the ecosystem metaphor, which is like covering local courts, for instance, which is really being decimated by the collapse of this model. But in other areas, the flourishing means that there's a tremendous amount of information out there. And it's just an example of the usefulness of opinion journalism. I read a lot of conservatives, and I follow a lot of conservatives on Twitter, and they have been doing really good reporting about the health exchanges. I mean, I've gotten the information I've gotten from good, hard-nosed reporters who are like, Alaska signed up 7 people. Whoa, okay. So that, from the production side, from what's out there to be consumed, I think it's actually kind of an amazing world right now. The problem is on the consumption side, right? Which sort of leads me into my next question. Right, which is like, are people consuming it? To what extent is journalism partly responsible for polarization? One argument is that the news is going the way of the music and television industry, more compartmentalization, more fractioning and particularized markets so that everyone gets exactly what they want. Isn't it true that a downside of the digital age is that it allows anyone to get exactly the kind of news they want to hear and shut out all ideas that may not be palatable?
I mean, do people have, the average American who's under more economic pressure than ever, you know, almost every household, both parents working, do they have time to sit down at night and look through this incredible ecosystem, the incredible offerings, and figure out, okay, I trust that outlet? And I don't have an answer. I don't want the clock to go back, but it's are we informing average Americans effectively? And I'm not sure we're doing that as effectively as we had in the past.
Okay, so
I agree.
Let's sort of get into another topic. The Obama administration has led an unprecedented crackdown on leakers and journalists who facilitate or publish those leaks. What do you think explains the administration's actions?
So I think there's basically 2 things. One is essentially the post-9/11 normal, in which there has been a trend towards greater government secrecy. The secret state has metastasized past all reckoning. I think that's just a demonstrably true fact. Whether people want to debate how effective it is, I think it's actually quite ineffective and desperately dangerous to democracy. So I think it's a natural consequence of the vector of American policy in the post-9/11 era, which is a vector towards greater and greater secrecy, greater and greater anxiety about the inability to maintain secrecy as secrecy grows larger. So paradoxically, the more you keep secret, the harder it is to keep secrets, and that creates more and more anxiety on the part of the secret keepers. And I think we've seen that all has come to fruition in the Edward Snowden affair, in which you're essentially playing whack-a-mole. But the basic problem is there's just too much stuff to guard. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think also there's a case to be made that the unprecedented amount of Espionage Act prosecutions by the Obama administration is partly a little bit of an accidental set of circumstances about prosecutions that happened for different reasons emanating out of sort of localized reasoning at the prosecutor level, as opposed to top-down directives from the White House. It is still the president's responsibility because it is his administration, but I think that one of the things that gets a little slippery, and I think you'd probably agree with this having covered the law, you know, DOJ is different than the Transportation Department in its relationship to the White House, and should be. You do not want it to be the case that the President of the United States is directing the Attorney General on what prosecutions to pursue and not pursue. The Department of Justice does have a tradition of independence that is quite distinct from the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, and so the stuff that's been coming out of the Department of Justice, I think it is partly due to the culture of the DOJ, Eric Holder himself, less than necessarily the Obama administration, which is not to take the administration off the hook, but just as sort of an explanatory framework for why we've seen this.
I think this, and there was just a report by the Committee to Protect Journalists. It's a group that usually attacks governments overseas for refusing to release information. They quoted dozens of, Washington reporters, establishment reporters, whatever, and they said this is the most controlling administration they have ever covered. Ann Compton from ABC News has covered 7 administrations. She said she's never seen anything like this. I think this is a very political president. I think they're constantly on message, and I think he's made a decision in the war on terror that he was going to deal with terrorism through the CIA and through drone strikes and covert operations. I don't understand. I do think, particularly at this point, he could have backed off on some of these cases.
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't know if he feels beholden to the CIA, but something is causing him in the internal politics in the government to show the intelligence community that he is going to be tough on these leaks.
Did you experience that firsthand?
It's very difficult to report in Washington these days. I'm working on a long profile for The Atlantic of Secretary of State John Kerry. On Tuesday, I had a staffer, send me a frantic email saying, if you quote me saying that, I'll be fired. You always hear stuff like that, but it is this tremendous fear of the White House and payback if you're sort of off message. And obviously in the last 16 days, we've seen another, maybe arguably worse political operation in terms of the House Republicans, but we shouldn't give a pass to this administration, particularly this deep into a second term. They could back off on these leak investigations, and they're really not.
So what does this portend for investigative journalism and the news gathering process for reporters if they can't feel free to protect their sources?
The quick answer is it's really difficult. David Sanger, who's been criticized, actually, he's the New York Times' chief Washington correspondent, and I've worked with him several times when I was at the paper. In this CPJ report, and David is famous for sort of potentially being nice to the White House, access journalism where you don't write anything too critical because then they'll shut you off. He called, the Obama administration the most control-freaky administration he's ever seen. And that's like counterintuitive for a reporter who wants access. And he says people will not talk to him because there's a criminal investigation about who told him about the Stuxnet virus, which was the virus that we sent in that destroyed some of the centrifuges in Iran. And he is radioactive now because there's a federal grand jury looking at that specific story and him. And people are like, don't email me, don't call me, long-time sources.
Two quick things. One is that, just to go back to sort of the foundational conceptual legal architecture here, it is, first of all, the 1917 Espionage Act is a terrible law through and through. It never should have been passed. It came at a horrible point in American politics. It's a bad law. Second of all, I think we all understand what espionage is, right? Espionage is spying. Espionage is betraying your country by giving secrets to a foreign power, an enemy, right? If Edward Snowden wanted to spy, well, Lord knows he could have. In fact, he probably would have gotten away with it much more than his exile in Russia right now. If what he wanted to do was commit espionage in the way that all of us understand that term, he could have committed espionage quite easily, as we have learned. He could have just never contacted journalists, left with the hundreds of thousands of files, and handed them over to his Chinese minder, or Russian minder, or Iranian minder, and then slipped off into the darkness, or come back to the United States. He did not do that. It is preposterous to conceive of what he did, whether you think it's right or wrong, and it is probably illegal in the sense that leaking classified information is illegal. But the idea that what he did is espionage does violence to our understanding semantically of what that word is. And that act, the Espionage Act, has been used to take things that are manifestly not espionage and classify them as espionage, which is a horrible, dangerous precedent. There is a big difference between giving information to a reporter and giving information to a foreign agent under cover of darkness and secrecy. And to conflate those two does tremendous, tremendous violence to our notions of daylight, sunlight, the sort of civic sphere, and the process of journalism.
And the criminal complaint in one case that involved James Rosen, a Fox News journalist,
even more dangerous,
declared him a co-conspirator in this. It was a State Department employee who leaked this ridiculously thing about a prediction that the North Koreans were potentially going to try to like test a bomb again or something like that. It was not there's this massive overclassification of information going on, and they backed off. The president said that's not going to happen anymore, but that was particularly outrageous that the journalist is somehow part of a criminal act if they publish the information they get.
Dana, I'd like you to weigh in on this next question. Many have perceived the tension between establishment journalism and the new frontier of digital media that emphasizes getting it fast and short. So how has mainstream journalism responded to this particular contingent of online writers and bloggers? And is there still a public appetite and need for longer form journalism and explanatory journalism?
Well, yes, to the second question, of course. I mean, the way that mainstream journalism has responded is they've hired us. So in 2005, 2006, young bloggers like Matt Iglesias or Ezra Klein were hired up by liberal magazines. And then by 2010, places like Slate and the Washington Post and the New York Times were launching their own blogs and hiring these people away. I mean, there's still that model I think still challenges mainstream organizations. I think if you look at Nate Silver and his experience at the New York Times with 538, it wasn't necessarily always the most natural fit to have a statistician who is writing about polls, whose own partisan bent was really clear. I think that was something new. But in 2005, 2006, if you were comfortable filing 5 times a day and loved blogging, you were sort of given free rein because editors were not familiar with that model, so it was actually a great time to start a journalism career. Now it's much more institutionalized. I don't think that it prevents that other second type of journalism from happening. I think, yes, it's exhausting to file that much, and it can be a bit of a digital sweatshop, as you said, but that's your dues paying period of your career. And then, hopefully you move on from that. And I think in terms of the sort of things that young people used to have to do to dues pay, it's better. Like, you'll actually learn a lot more, you'll write a lot more, and like I said, I think all these things can coexist. But the challenge is the funding model for how you get paid for it.
David, you want to talk a little bit about the sort of appetite for long form? Or
yeah, it's at the Times where I was for 15 years, and at Reuters, there's a real change, and even in the Atlantic, there's this sense that you have to have a really good short game, meaning quick blogs, quick analysis, great reporting, and a really good long game. One of the things that happened was, and this might be somewhat dated now, but Wired came out with an app for the iPad, Wired magazine, which would be your bells and whistles, fascinating stuff. And then the New Yorker came out with its own app. And one of them was an incredible success on the iPad, and it was the New Yorker. There's this, people reading on the iPad are reading much longer articles. They're engaging much more for much longer periods of time, and it's a very different reading pattern than if you're sitting at your desktop looking at the screen there. That tends to be the fast thing. So my editors at The Atlantic are now intent on having a mix of really substantive stuff. The longest pieces in The Atlantic are some of the best on the website, and then the really short stuff. And it's the kind of traditional, I guess on the one hand, on the other hand, 1,000-word news story that it's dying, and maybe that's good. Mm-hmm. But the institutions have been too slow to adapt, the older ones.
Technologically, we look at things like Instapaper and long form, and there's been the last couple of years have been really exciting for long form, and you see things like Byliner and Atavist, these new startups that are trying to create a model for this. Sometimes the writer works with less of an advance, but they get more of the percentage of any profits that come for the writing. On Amazon, the Kindle singles, that's a whole new model. I think it's interesting, the gap in length between a book and a magazine article, there used to be not a lot that a writer could do with something that's, say, 30,000 words. And now there's this whole new format, the Kindle single type of format. So I think that we are seeing that there is a hunger for long form, and there are new models coming that writers can take advantage of.
Okay. I fear that the hows and the whys aren't really being addressed enough in our coverage of the news. because of this emphasis on blogging and short and fast and tweets and whatever. What do you think?
I think it comes back to the thing I said before, which is that if you want it, it's there, right? And the question is like, what is getting to the end user? So from my perspective, like every bit of reporting you needed about the shutdown was out there. I mean, everything from the procedural rules of the House on a motion to recommit and about how many votes it was going to take, or a discharge petition. I mean, how many articles were in the New York Times about a discharge petition? Like, there was a lot of reporting about what a discharge, do people know what a discharge petition is? Discharge petition is a kind of Hail Mary pass that's thrown by the minority in the House of Representatives, in which they get a majority of the House to sign a petition and bring something to a vote. So this is one of the kind of gambits that was being floated by the Democrats. So, the real nitty-gritty of this shutdown, which came down to a bunch of kind of procedural feints, was being covered. I mean, I think the discharge petition actually did get an article in the New York Times. But it got an article in the New York Times after it had been covered by a whole bunch of bloggers and other folks online who were pretty deeply sourced with, Democrats. And so, again, I think the nitty-gritty of almost any story, with the exception of sort of, but even that, even Syria, there's incredible reporting on Syria right now. I mean, it's probably the most dangerous place in the world, arguably, I would say, to report out of. And there's pretty incredible reporting coming out of there. And it's a combination of, big enterprises like the New York Times, and some networks have some people there, but it's also there's smaller startups. There's one Syria sort of journalism project that has just started up to cover the war. And so the nitty-gritty is there. I think the question that David was saying before is like, is that getting to the typical end user?
Yeah.
Through and whereas it used to get through the channel of, say, the Providence Journal, where all that was funneled through to the article that you picked up when you got up in the morning. Yeah. That's the question. In terms of is it being done, it's being done. I mean, it's like there's incredibly granular reporting about every single thing happening.
But are we making it too hard for people to get that?
Well, that's the other problem, I think.
It's hard because then Reuters, which is a very traditional organization, I sat next to Felix Salmon. He's their finance blogger. He's this incredibly prolific guy. One interesting thing that I notice and think about sometimes is that Felix does not say he's a reporter. He says, I'm a blogger. He reads voluminously, encyclopedically. He writes all the time. He tweets all the time. I wonder if there are 3 of him. And was hoping that sitting next to him through osmosis, I would get faster. It hasn't worked. There's almost different jobs, and to tie into Syria. So what he does is an incredible skill, and it should be respected. And sort of older journalists shouldn't feel threatened by and denigrate bloggers. It's amazing what he does, and Ezra Klein and many other people do, and they're beating traditional journalists all the time. But expecting people to also field report is almost impossible for a human being to do.
Yep.
And what has happened in Syria in terms of foreign correspondence, Reuters has people in there. Steve Alley, the editor of Reuters, is committed to the story, but he's terrified of what's going to happen to his staff. The rough number of journalists that are kidnapped today in Syria is about 14. It's become too dangerous for reporters to go in there. The Times has stopped sending people in because it's so dangerous. And that's sort of a separate conversation about international reporting. It fits in this rubric, though, of the very expensive, very important reporting that there is really no way to finance.
Yeah, I think
investigative and foreign are the 2 real problems.
It's so funny because sometimes I hear a friend say, I was on my New York Times app on my iPhone and an ad popped up. And I want to wring their necks and say, they sent somebody to Syria for you, look at the damn ad.
How dare they?
So I think one of the things that we've all been talking about in the last decade or 15 years in journalism is, will we train the consumer to understand that this content isn't free? And I'm actually hopeful on that. I think that print will die. I think for 90% of publications that are now in print, they will either go away completely or they'll be online only, and there'll be a few legacy media organizations, perhaps like the New York Times, Washington Post, New Yorker, maybe especially some of the glossy magazines like Vogue or Elle or GQ Esquire, that will remain in print. I think for most places, print will die. And it's almost like we would like to hurry this transition up. Because once the market kind of moves more fully to online, then I think the consumer will be more willing to pay and will understand that that is what is required to read this stuff. So we'll see what happens. I think we're still in this weird, awkward in-between phase.
But it's not working in that so what's died is is the revenue, the ad revenue that's from the print newspapers. If the New York Times stopped printing tomorrow, they could not fund their current newsroom from their digital revenues.
Right.
And I grew up in Maine, and the Portland Press Herald is the main newspaper in the whole state. They were on the verge of going out of business. A local, billionaire has been funding them. Their web traffic is way up, and their print circulation is dropping. Their online ad revenues are tiny.
Yeah.
Right.
And people won't pay much in circulation, and they're losing like $2 million a year.
Here's one of the problems. I mean, when advertising was in print, there were no metrics or data on how the readers interacted with the ads. Now with the internet, the advertiser knows exactly how many people clicked on their ads, and the numbers are low. They're depressingly low.
Turns out it was a bad deal to advertise in
exactly.
papers for all those years.
It was great for journalists.
So it was great for us, but now the advertisers know that most readers, their eyes just completely skim over these advertisements, and they're not deeply engaging with these things. I mean, I think what it looks like now, I hope, is not going to be what it looks like a decade from now, in terms of the sorts of ads we see and the other options that are out there for advertisers. I mean, I think we just have to hope that it'll change, and I think the subscribers and audience has to contribute a lot more economically into this model.
It was Derek Thompson, this piece he posted in The Atlantic, I might be wrong, but it was something about the increase in online revenues is 1/10 of the drop in total newspaper
There's just money being
revenues.
sucked right out of it.
Yes, it is not, the lines are not coming together in the middle at all. But maybe if you want to pay more for your online subscriptions, please do.
So I'm curious though, when you ask that question, like hows and whys, it strikes me that the two areas in which both of you have done reporting are actually the two areas where this is the biggest problem, which is the two areas that are most poorly served by the new model is particularly foreign conflict reporting, which is incredibly expensive and resource intensive and requires a lot of institutional capacity around it, and then regional politics, local and regional, city hall, state capitals, which have been completely destroyed. I mean, their press corps have been destroyed. Those two strike me as the two places where this model is doing the worst job.
So what has happened to the Providence Journal? You have to answer. Just numbers-wise.
The staff's been decimated, and our circulation figures have gone down as well.
When you say decimated, how big is over the 40 years, how much has it dropped?
Oh, well, we used to have like 9 bureaus at one point in the state, and we don't even have a bureau anymore. I mean, we're all downtown, and I would say that about half the desks in the newsroom are empty. So, I mean, we're just not being able with the funding that we're getting. And, this is part of a national problem. This is not just ours, where we're not getting the kind of advertising that we were before through print. Some of the largest advertisers have gone out of business here, or are just doing mailings instead of advertising in the paper anymore. And then, we went from a model where we, like everybody else, we were giving everything away for free online. And then all of a sudden, overnight, we were charging for everything. And people got used to getting all of their news for free, and they don't want to pay for it anymore. And I think that's part of the problem everywhere. So it's not just here. I guess what I fear for the future is that so many of the journalism programs, or if there's not a journalism program, nonfiction writing programs, not ours, but in other places, are eliminating courses, for instance, in investigative reporting and public affairs reporting, and replacing them with courses on digital media. And I'm wondering what this means for the quality of the news that the public is going to get for decades to come. What do you think?
I think young journalists have to do both. You need the skills. That's your advantage.
Yeah, but no one should be taking a class in digital media. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. I mean, honestly,
You can learn that
you
in my
can learn
course.
that. Like, yeah, that's, I mean, like the idea that you would spend tuition dollars to have, like, that, you can learn that.
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
I spent a year as a fellow working out of the Columbia Journalism School, and one of the things that really did surprise me is there were classes on things like social media, and I was like, just get on Twitter and start trying it out. Like, you will learn how to use it. So that's bad. But at the same time, I don't think you can learn a lot in a class, but I don't think academia has ever been the most useful training ground for this profession. You learn by doing and by getting into a newsroom and finding mentors and getting practice. So I hope that those traditions continue. I mean, I remember in the first couple of years of my career, I kept thinking, will somebody teach me how to file a FOIA request? I didn't know how to do that. It turned out it was really easy, but I definitely had to seek out, someone and ask them to teach me how to do that. So those skills are important. But I think journalism is a craft more than it is a profession where we're going to see schools do a lot of the training.
Okay, so I just have a couple more questions before we open this up to the floor. I guess one of my questions is, why have we moved from revering journalists during the Watergate era to a time today where there seems to be a complete loss of public awareness and interest in financially supporting good journalism?
Tracy, your questions are so depressing.
Well, I'm sorry.
Chris is revered, don't you think?
And reviled.
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem. I think it's part of it is the political polarization of the country, which is driven by a lot of different things: economic changes, the redistricting, whatever, the technological change. So I don't know, and maybe Chris is right that it was never that wonderful.
But we're ink-stained
Walter-
wretches. Like, it's okay if they don't like us. I don't know.
But it is a problem. When I worked for the New York Times, I did a story about the oil spill in the Gulf, the BP oil spill, and I was being frankly, a vulture reporter. We literally set out to find every member of the crew of the Deepwater Horizon and the families of those who had died and interview them about what had happened and how BP handled it all. And I was honestly trying to find the house of a crew member who had died, and I ended up at the wrong house. And it was very late at night, and I was in the middle of South Texas, and I knock on the door, and this guy opens up, and I said, "I'm a reporter from the New York Times." And he goes, "The New York Times?" and I was like, and then he finds out I'm looking for this crew member, and the whole community knows about it. He ends up inviting me to stay for the night. We have this incredibly engaging discussion all night about, why won't the New York Times report that Barack Obama is a Muslim? What is wrong with you guys? And his son.
You call your assignment editor, you're like, I got a hot tip.
And that was sort of one of my arguments was like, I'm a scumbag journalist, and if, he really was a Muslim, we would, and reporters more than anything else, I mean, people have their political biases, but more than anything else, they're ambitious and competitive. But what really got him, and it's sort of a silly anecdote, and I'm just trying to be a little positive about the future of the country, was that I said,
that's silly.
The argument that, he emailed me the other day, and he is right, he's on the complete other end, he was an evangelical preacher in Texas, complete on the other side of the spectrum. The winning argument, though, was, that Hillary Clinton, don't you? And he said, yes. And I said, don't you think if he was Muslim, Hillary Clinton would have used it to crush him in 2008? And he goes, you're right. But human conversation, a dinner, a breakfast, it worked. And I don't know how we go back to that, but I think we're reviled because Democrats or Republicans tell you that the New York Times is evil and the Wall Street Journal is evil.
The other thing I would say is that there's a broader trend here. So this is something I wrote about in my book, but there's a few different organizations that have been polling on Americans' trust in core institutions, pillar institutions. Mm-hmm. Pew has been doing it. Gallup has been doing it. There's a sort of biannual national election survey that does some questions on this. And the fact of the matter is, Americans don't trust anything except for the military. Essentially every institution in American life is at all-time low levels of trust. So that is true of journalists, it is also true of education, it is also true of universities, it is also true of doctors. So I'm not quite sure that journalists have suffered a kind of reputational fall that is below trend, essentially, for a whole variety of other...
But have journalists contributed to that dynamic by attacking all these institutions and claiming they're part of left or right-wing conspiracy?
Yeah, I think there's a school of thought that says that. I mean, the people that will tell you that is if you interview people in power.
Yeah.
They will tell you all the time
misunderstood.
that it's journalists' fault that people don't trust anyone.
Okay. Well, I've got an upbeat question, okay? So, I really do. The Senate Judiciary Committee recently passed a federal reporter shield law, which journalists have been fighting for years. So how important is this, and what do you think the chances are of this legislation actually getting passed?
I think it's a great forward step, and I should say the administration supported that shield law. So I'm encouraged by that. Part of my criticism of Obama was more with Snowden and the leaks, and that the president called for this debate about surveillance, and I missed it. There was no debate. So to be fair to the administration, they have supported, and I think the shield law will pass. It's a great step forward, but there's just other areas that remain shrouded in secrecy.
Matt Cooper, who great reporter and did several months of jail time during the whole Valerie Plame affair because he wouldn't give up his source, who it turned out later was Karl Rove, who then came forward and sort of said, well, it was me, and then he got out of jail. Matt wrote a really good piece about the shield law where he basically said, it's not really laws that keep journalists out of jail, it's norms. And that one of the things that's really dangerous about what's happened in the DOJ's approach is eating away at sort of norms and precedents. I mean, there's certain things, the most powerful prohibition is the prohibition on things that are just not done. And you've seen this in our political process, which is like routine filibustering of every bill just wasn't done before until it was. And there's a lot of space in any kind of institutional setting between norms and rules, things that are allowed under the rules but just aren't done in terms of the norms. And so I think the shield law is really important, but it's actually more important, I think, as kind of resetting a norm than it is actually in its legal enforcement. It's a kind of communication about what the norm should be about how journalists are approached in this context.
And the norms have been broached, and you maybe all heard this, but there was the leak investigation into the AP story about this, the underwear bomber from Yemen. And what normally the Department of Justice would go to the news organization and say, we want to subpoena your phone records, and give the news organization the chance to fight that in court and get a judge to block it. Unprecedented, DOJ under Eric Holder went in and got the phone for all the phone records for the AP bureau on Capitol Hill, several bureaus across the U.S. In like Hartford and New York as well, and it worked. They found the leaker by going and getting these phone records. And who's going to call? What source is going to call the AP now? And there was no warning. AP had no chance to challenge it in court, and that had never ever happened before. And that's to me a really scary new norm.
And I guess one more question, and then we will take yours, please. So, I'm sorry, it's, I guess, another depressing one, but what do you think the lessons are to be learned, though, from the gross malpractice in reporting the breaking news surrounding the Boston Marathon bombings, the Newtown school massacre, the Navy Yard shooting?
Well, to be optimistic, there were gross inaccuracies, but they were corrected very quickly. I mean, I think one of the, when you're publishing online and there's these comment sections under these articles, like 95% of it is total crap, but 5% of it teaches me something as a writer. I get corrected all the time by my readers, or they give me a really good idea for something to follow up on. This climate offers more feedback than ever before, and it is disturbing and tragic. I know with the Boston Marathon thing, there were lives that were sort of upended by the false reporting, including the Brown student. Yeah.
I mean, that we should note, right? There was a sort of combination of a website called Reddit in which there were sort of amateurs
Yeah.
sifting through photos. There was no news organization except for Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, which
Yeah.
put the picture of
Yeah.
two kids on the cover of the New York Post the day after. Now, you want to talk about legacy and whatever. New York Post was founded by Alexander Hamilton, right? Like, that's like as legacy as it gets. So like, people, it was messed up and totally ridiculous that this Reddit thread existed in which people thought they were going to like vigilante style ID the killer based on crowd shots. But for the New York Post to put, they got their asses sued, which they should have. Put these two random kids, including this Moroccan American track runner who was 19, who posted on his Facebook, "I'm going to the police right now, shit just got real." Because this poor dude was like, wakes up to find himself on the cover. It's funny now because his name was cleared, but like, so the other thing I would say out of that is, A, people should slow down. No one remembers. Does anyone remember what's the first news outlet that ID'd, said that Johar Tsarnaev was surrounded? I don't know. No one knows. There's nothing there. There's no legacy there. No one cares. Getting it right is much more important than getting it first in those environments. The other thing I would say is, from a historical perspective, the internet makes things worse. Absolutely, social media and the sort of like virality of rumor. But if you go back and I read a great book once about the history of the Chicago Fire, and it was exactly the same thing out of the Chicago Fire. The rumors about that there were race riots on the South Side, that roving gangs of black assailants were roving through the streets and beating up Germans, and all these this sort of carnival of horribles that was coming out of it. It was all reported in the papers at the Times. Was all the information spread throughout. It was all wrong, all of it. Like a lot of the reporting of Katrina, people shooting from helicopters, all sorts of erroneous reporting. A lot of that out of legacy, good. Part of it is that crises and chaotic environments produce false information and rumor.
And now it gets corrected faster. It's much faster than it used to.
Yeah, but is there no shame in having to make a correction anymore?
Oh, well, there should be. I hope places like the New York Post learn their lesson after they get sued. So I think part of it, Twitter, that's asking too much, right? Yeah. I don't know. I'm just thinking through it, but I think news organizations are still learning how to use some of these new tools. And hopefully there will be an evolution in a positive direction.
We actually, I'll just speak from experience, we have very strong rules at MSNBC that come from NBC News standards about tweeting during breaking news.
Yeah.
And I've caught myself a few times not retweeting things I've seen, even from reputable organizations like the AP or other places, because I work for a news organization and there's a central database called HOT, and that's the stuff that's vetted. And during the Boston Marathon stuff, we have this amazing reporter named Pete Williams who did a great job reporting stuff and did not report wrong stuff. And we were basically saved from making a lot of embarrassing mistakes by his reporting and by also being instructed quite clearly to wait on his reporting before you go around saying anything or retweeting things.
I just worry about the economic pressures when you're just trying to get revenue and web traffic. There'll be pressures from owners to go faster, which leads me to keep, thinking the nonprofit model is, and all of media should not be nonprofit, but at least that there's a little bit less pressure in that kind of environment.
Okay. So now it's open to you. I thought there were microphones in the aisles, but they're not.
Fire hazard reasons. So please just raise your hand. Brendan will call on you. Then stand up, state your name, where you're from, also state anything else you want, and then just please speak loudly so that
The acoustics are good in here.
Yes.
My name is Karen Easton. I'm from the UK, as you can probably hear. And I'd be very interested in the panel what you think about the fact whether the BBC model in the UK, obviously funded by the taxpayer through licence fees, is a model that can sustain unbiased journalism in a polarised, increasingly polarised world, and B, if it would ever have any applicability to the US.
You state the question.
Yeah.
Do you want to restate it?
She's wondering whether the BBC model, which is funded by the taxpayers, in Great Britain would be a model that might work here in the United States.
And also if it would continue to sustain.
How much
And
of
whether it
the,
would continue to sustain
how much of the
leadership.
BBC's budget is sort of from the government itself? Not the user fees, but percentages.
I don't know.
It's a
I don't
significant,
know.
so my only concern is anything involving funding from Congress is not going to work in this country. No, it should. It's just that it's whoever is controlling the majority is going to say, aha. I mean, look at what's happened to NPR.
Yeah.
And it's all, I think it's NPR is struggling like everyone, but it's a blessing. Are they receiving any money or very little?
They're a few years from being zeroed out
Yeah,
entirely.
I
I mean, they're
mean-
basically at
But it's
10% or something.
I think it's good they'll be zeroed out.
Yeah,
I hate to
right.
say it, but
Yeah, I think the BBC model is amazing, and I think the nature of American politics at this moment. I think if the BBC, if we had our own BBC that had been around since the 1950s, there'd be a shot that we could continue it. The idea that we would start something like the BBC now is just completely impossible to conceive of. And partly because the right hates public media and has for a long time, and has an ideological disposition towards it, which I respect. I don't agree with, but and hates public media in Britain too. I mean, the BBC has been, I mean, it's been unprecedented the way the right has gone after the BBC just in the last 2 years, particularly. And so, you know, the future of the BBC, even in England, I think is a little bit uncertain at this moment. But I think that it's just impossible to conceive of anything like that in our current political environment getting started. If we inherited some legacy product that commanded this kind of broad respect the way the BBC has and maybe still does, then I think possibly, but I don't think we could start something like that now.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I really appreciated Twilight of the Elites.
Oh, thanks.
So I very much liked this one line you have. We have jettisoned any vestigial affection for civic equality in exchange for the false promise of a hierarchy of merit. And that focus on civic equality and social institutions is something that comes throughout the entire book and is an interest of mine. And it's something that comes up a lot when you talk about social institutions, especially ones which are news, which generate the information that we have about our world. And what do you think the role of journalism, modern news organizations, especially today, after we've lost the big three, Cronkite, et cetera, what do you think their role is in creating civic community, equality, and solidarity, especially, you know, after like Putnam and, you know, the death of social capital and the death of civic organizations?
That's a great question. So I think that the best kind of journalism forms community around it or is embedded in some kind of community. The great virtue of the period of great, vibrant local papers was precisely that. I mean, I was a young reporter in Chicago in the last few years of Chicago as a great newspaper town, basically. Particularly in the last few years of the Chicago Reader, which is one of the best alternative weeklies in the country, where I learned to write and got trained. There was just this incredible two-way conversation happening between the publication and the people in the community. I mean, it was like, we would cover something, then it would become a story that people were talking about, and then politicians would respond, and then we would cover the politicians responding, and it strengthened the civic fabric of the place that we were in. And I'm not sure that we've, at the local level particularly, found a way to replace that. And I think that's a really, it's a great point about the social utility of journalism when it's embedded in a place particularly, that it does create community, and it actually creates concern. I mean, that's the other thing I think that is really important, is that people who are in the community are taking their cues a little bit about what's important off the kind of pillar journalistic institutions in that community. And it has this kind of agenda-setting role and power that I think we've gotten rid of, much to our, we're poorer for having gotten rid of it. There is a virtual component of that, which is that there are virtual communities through social media that have sprung up around very small outlets. There's this small, very radical lefty magazine called Jacobin that I love, that's edited by this guy who's 22 or 23. And there's this community around it, and it attracts all these very interesting people, very radical labor organizers, Marxists, economists, and it's a world that I don't, write for the magazine, but I am now kind of embedded in because I follow those people on Twitter and I read their bylines, and I've gotten to learn a kind of world there, and it's created a community around itself. So that community creating potential exists there, but it's much more virtual now, and it's much less broad, and I think we've lost the kind of community creating role that great local, particularly newspapers, have played in places.
And
No, do you want to?
I just, and a little optimistic thing in which you look at Twitter, that blogs have kind of died. It's not like there's a million blogs out there and everyone has time to read them. You are getting these virtual communities forming online, and that's a positive thing. And some of those communities are forming around, some of the surviving news organizations as well.
Yes.
So, hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a freshman at Brown. So I feel like we've been hinting at this throughout the entire panel that people are very easily pigeonholed now based on the publications they write for as either conservative or a left writer. And so I'm wondering, I guess this is mostly for Chris, but if you have been established as a journalist who is associated with a certain political ideology or a certain side, how do you begin to combat that image and prove to the American public that you can, in fact, create objective journalism?
So I have no interest in combating that image because I think that actually, and it's a great question, right? But like there's a billion reasons why I can never host Meet the Press, right? But one of them is that, someone has that job and he does a very good job, but one of them is the fact that the Meet the Press audience, there are a lot of conservatives watch that show and they would be like, are you kidding me? Of course, you can't have this person. So what I find really insidious is not opinionated journalism or worldview-driven journalism or ideological journalism. What I find insidious is people smuggling normative commitments, ideological predispositions, and pursuing a kind of agenda under the cover of ostensible objectivity. So I have no interest in lying to people or pretending. We have conservative viewers. I have conservatives on my show. There's conservatives who watch the show, and they watch it. They know where I come from. They want to hear the arguments I make, or they respect the fact that we're not putting lies on, that we vet and think hard about what we put on, that the reporting we bring on the show is true. But they're not coming because I'm trying to get one over on anyone. And in fact, I think that actual transparency about that is really important. I think that I think the existence of conservative media is great. And if Fox were like every night, if their motto is like, this is the conservative take, or this is what we're bringing you, as opposed to like, we are the objective, fair, and balanced. It's that branding more than the content that bothers me. Go do it.
But all week, Sean Hannity has been saying millions of Americans are losing their jobs right now because of Obamacare, and that is false.
That's false.
So it's not just the branding; it is the facts that they are reporting.
Yes.
You know, and it just frustrates me to no end.
No, that I agree with. I think. But so my answer to you is like, I'm transparent about what I believe in. I'm transparent about the fact that I consider myself part of the American left. I proudly claim being part of an amazing tradition of the American left. I respect the fact that there are people who are on the American right, and there are people that have ideas completely different than mine. And there are a lot of people I read and respect and like a great deal who are on the other side of the spectrum. But I actually think the most useful thing in the world I occupy, not if I were writing for the New York Times, which I actually think is a different thing, or the Providence Journal is a different thing. I think it is important to kind of have this kind of mask. I think that's actually important in those institutional settings. But in the setting I'm in, I don't want anyone to be fooled. People should know, fair warning, this is what you're getting. And if I say something that's wrong, we should be called on it, That's my feeling.
Yes.
My name is Zach Nazera. I'm an education organizer, and I graduated from Brown last year. My question is also about sincerity. Brown has cast itself as a defender of liberal values, and in a lot of cases that's very true. This panel is an example of thinking about that kind of stuff. But at the same time, what is the responsibility of departments like the English department here in correcting or swinging back towards, if not objectivity, then sincerity? it seems like we've had at least an ostensible move away from the humanities at this university. And I'm sure that would be debated, but if that is happening here, and I'm sure it's happening to an even greater extent at other universities and down the line, how are we going to fix this problem that we've talked about? And what is the responsibility of Brown?
I think this is a really great question. I'm finishing up a book right now on the history of education in the United States. You know, it used to be that only 10% of people went to high school in this country, if you go back to 1900. And as each level of education opened up to the masses, and that's the stage we're at right now with college, there has been an attack on the liberal arts curriculum in each subsequent stage. So it happened first in the junior high school, and then in the high school, and now we're seeing it in higher education. I think there's two things. For the vast numbers of American students who are not able to complete college currently, who would like to because of student debt issues, because there's no social supports for young parents who have kids who would like to be continuing their education. I think that as progressives, we need to be open-minded to things like online learning that might strike us initially as an attack on the liberal arts or our conception of the ideal university. Places like this are something that 1% of the population gets to experience, and I think it is our responsibility here to be vociferous defenders of the liberal arts. But if schools like this will not embrace a responsibility to diversify, not just racially, but deeply socioeconomically, it becomes very hard to defend this model.
I agree.
We've started a lot of, or several online courses, including an online writing course this past summer, and I think they will continue to grow. And I also have to say that my students are going off campus all the time reporting on lots of important social, economic issues and talking to people who are the voiceless and powerless here that don't have a voice. And they don't turn in stories that have, you know, a political agenda, because I teach them not to be writing that way. I mean, they may go on to do what you're doing, or they may go on to, you know, write for some political review, but I think, you know, I mean, some of our students here have done incredible stuff. I mean, I was co-teaching a course with a professor in public policy a few years ago, and we actually used computer database tapes from the court system to show how drunk driving laws were being applied very differently from community to community, which changed the whole way that drunk driving was policed here. I mean, so I think we are making a difference here, and I don't think we're doing it with a political agenda.
Tracy teaches a really fact-based course, and I just want to, there's just a responsibility to not present false facts to the public. And one thing that concerns me is no one is totally unbiased, but there are facts.
Yes.
And I don't want...
Don't tell the MCM department.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. So you'll get a critique. I mean, I'm the simpleton reporter. You know, of course you fool. There is, you're always biased, but there's a danger to not respecting basic facts. And Tracy, I'm biased, and I taught a class here too. Everyone fears her, and she's incredibly strict though about, show me that this fact is true. Go out and look at that court record. Go out and talk to that homeless person. And there's a whole other art of opinion, and whether an argument's right or wrong is a different thing, but the number of homeless people in Providence is a basic fact that we have to start agreeing on more as a society, I think.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Leo. I'm from Philly. And I want to ask about a point that you, Chris, made earlier in the discussion. You made a point of distinguishing the Snowden scandal from espionage. And, we live in a world today where information is one of the most valuable assets, really one of the ultimate powers you can have over everything else. And so in effect, I feel that, you know, Snowden's impact might have been equivalent to espionage. And I want to know, as successful reporters, what you guys think about the priority of information, accessible information, in a world like ours, where that can be more dangerous than you can ever know.
So the problem with that argument is that it proves too much, right? Which is to say that if the standard is whether an act of reporting is equivalent to espionage in the information that's transmuted, you have criminalized broad swaths of every single bit of reporting. I mean, it could be the case that something about the nature of something the Taliban was doing was useful to one of America's enemies. For instance, Iran, who hate the Taliban and have been trying to get rid of them for basically 15 years, worked with us actually in the beginning of the Afghanistan invasion, right? Iran is an enemy of the United States. We don't have diplomatic relations with them. I think it's fair to say they're one of our chief threats, right? If David reports on something about the Taliban, internal of the Taliban, that's important, good, newsworthy stuff, and that happens to be useful information for an Iranian intelligence agent who is reading that, and we say that that is equivalent to espionage, we have now criminalized, essentially, all possible foreign reporting. So that can't be the test, unless we're willing to accept the consequences of that, which would be essentially to do that. In fact, there's an interesting wrinkle to the Chelsea Manning case. Formerly Bradley Manning, in which one of the one charge that the judge did not allow was a charge the government gave in which they charged Chelsea Manning explicitly with aiding the enemy on the legal theory that the enemy, Al-Qaeda, had an internet connection and could have read WikiLeaks cables. And to the judge's great credit, that argument was rejected as just too tenuous. Precisely, I think, because of the profoundly broad ramifications that an argument and legal precedent would have like that along the lines you're indicating. There's no question that information and informational leaks have all sorts of cascading consequences for the geopolitical rivalries that are happening, at any given moment between America and its rivals, allies, enemies, friends, etc. But that's always going to be the case. I think we essentially just have to accept that's going to be the case. And I think that, frankly, in the absence of specific harms to specific individuals, which can be shown by the government prior to publishing, that it's not the journalist's job to really worry about that. You would have more.
Yes. Yeah.
I found this panel very, very interesting. My name is Juan Levy. I live in Philadelphia, and my daughter is a student here at Brown. I am flooded with information. I cannot handle this flood of information. And I'm sure I'm not alone. So where in this whole conversation is the editor? And in this conversation of the lack of trust, and in the conversation of the loss of local and court reporting and regional reporting, and you have Bruce Katz, another Brown alum who's published a book about the rise of the power base being local in this country, where the state and federal governments are in complete disarray. Don't we need the editor to help us figure out what's what, to help us avoid, and how to avoid having these, even this presentation of the kook at essentially the same value as the fact, because we feel we have to be balanced. And then for us consumer, we are absolutely at a loss as to how to deal with this. So what do? We dismiss it all. Where is the editor?
So watch, read, and listen to quality journalism. And that's not a good answer for you. It is a problem. People need a way to vet information. The one way we're failing, I think, is giving people sort of guideposts and that kind of stuff. But what you watch and pay for really matters. And I think that the institutions are dying. Some are going to revive, because I think people are going to come to the conclusion you have, that it sort of is coming back to wanting to have a reliable source of facts. But I understand your frustration, and I don't have a great answer for you.
But it's also priority. I mean, I think that's, when you're talking about editor, I mean, like, that's, the hardest part of my job every day is when we come in for our story meeting and we have 40 stories on the board and we've got 6 slots in the rundown. And that's the page 1 meeting at any newspaper is the same thing, right? It's not just what's out there, it's what's important. It's what's our A block tonight. It's what, what we try to do is precisely that. I mean, we put on a show for an hour every night. And our hope is that if someone has basically been at work all day and comes home and is like, what happened today? That we're giving them, certainly from one perspective, but a kind of truthful and legitimate encapsulation of what happened that day that was important.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Yes?
And so, about the truth, and Chris, heard you say everybody's in such a rush to get the scoop, but who really remembers what's out there? I think, hallelujah, I agree with that. Take a little time, get it right. But the thing is, too, it's all about a question of truth. Like, you were talking about Sean Hannity speaking out and just saying whatever's on his mind. And the other day I remember hearing him saying, oh yeah, everybody's been talking about the government shutdown and first day, and my life is the same. There are people out there like Jon Stewart, for instance, immediately comes to mind, who will call people to task for that. Is there any other way, because John obviously is preaching to the choir, the people who are watching him. Is there any way on a broader scale that we can hold people accountable for just, it should be Fox Opinion, not Fox News, I think, but other than that, is there a way that we can call people to task for just say, in fact, non-factual stuff?
Obama's going to arrest all of them now.
FEMA camps.
It's actually funny because in the world of philanthropists who fund journalism, these things like factcheck.com have become actually really popular. And some of those do a better job than others. One thing that was really disturbing to me in the world of education is that the Gates Foundation funded a site that was supposed to tell you whether or not an education story was true, according to the Gates Foundation's funding priorities of what was important in education reform. So I think we are all our own editors and fact checkers today. And I think, I don't know, I don't think there is any one sort of institution that can come from on high and police this realm.
Can I ask you two a question off that question, which is, did you, in the newsroom culture of a place like Providence Journal or the New York Times, was explicitly like taking a shot at the competitor? How is that viewed? Like if some competitor wrote something that you thought was wrong, how did you deal with that? Like, how did you deal with a news outlet or someone sort of saying something that was demonstrably wrong?
Well, we ignored it. I mean, we just did our own reporting and wrote what we thought was right.
Right.
But I mean, global warming denialism is a really interesting case study because for a long time, those people were quoted as authorities in all sorts of mainstream news outlets, and it was like, oh, I call the environmentalists, now I'll call the global warming denier people. And it's not legitimate, and this old model was supporting that, and that's wrong, And there is a problem there, and I think more newspapers are having a more critical in-house conversation now about what the limits of objectivity are. And do we stop at the point of giving a voice to people who are in the evidence-free zone, which we've been talking about. This country has an evidence-free zone. I don't think that it's everyone. I think it's about a third of us. That's my impression.
Okay,
and I would just say, and this is hugely simplistic, but again, sort of, find the source you rely on and support that source. And then, if there are people of other political views, but they exist in an evidence-based world, listen to them, praise them. I wrote a column this week for Reuters and The Atlantic, comparing the Sanity Caucus and the Republicans versus the Kamikaze Caucus. And I said we should be praising the Sanity Caucus. They're not all wrong. We get a big debate about, whether we have a long-term debt problem or not. But there are sane Republicans who are trying to, improve the situation there. And so continuing this cycle of just denigrating the other side, not listening to them, it doesn't, help us. And there are, I'm just saying, we just need to listen to each other more instead of talking past each other.
The other thing I would say is there's a whole fascinating, robust literature on confirmation bias. And there's a bunch of interesting findings in it. One of the interesting findings is that if you give people sort of opposing viewpoints, it actually reaffirms their own confirmation bias more. So this has been robustly demonstrated in a variety of experimental settings, which is sort of kind of a bummer of a result, because you'd like to think for the kind of, the marketplace of ideas sort of liberal paradigm is that wouldn't happen. The social research notwithstanding, I would say that don't hate read and don't hate watch. Don't read stuff that you know is wrong and drives you crazy, because it's going to, first of all, cause you needless anxiety, and second of all, it's going to make you think worse about the other side than you should. What you should be doing is you should be finding those people who have different viewpoints from your own, who are good reporters, and they exist. There's a lot of great conservative journalism. I'm speaking as a liberal. There's a lot of great conservative journalism that's out there. There's a lot of great conservative journalism I read and rely on every day. And it makes me think more highly of the people on that side of the ideological spectrum, that I am making sure to read the best arguments they have rather than the worst.
Okay. I think
Can we have a lady questioner? A young lady?
Okay.
Women.
Who's the conservative?
No, that's it. That was a perfect example.
Okay, we've got time for one more here.
My name is Milana Prendo. I'm a freshman here at Brown, and I was wondering, how has the increased communication between readers and journalists affected the space for journalists? Has it become a less safe zone because of the increased polarization? Has there been attacks? How has that been facilitated?
You get attacked more than any of us.
There's amazing things about reader interaction and viewer interaction. People, I mispronounced the other night on air the language from the Philippines, Tagalog. I had just been having a conversation about Girl Scout cookies earlier that day, and so Tagalong was in my head, and I said Tagalog, and literally 50 people within 30 seconds were like, "Bro, get it together, it's Tagalog." And there's I get a lot of amazing responses from people that say this is my healthcare.gov story, this is and I have my email addresses on the internet, anyone can email me, it's actually my email address, I actually see it and read it. The downside is people write horrible, unfathomably awful things to me too. And you just kind of learn to
Yeah, I mean, our newspaper actually stopped the practice of allowing people who didn't identify themselves to put in comments, because every time we ran a story, let's say on immigration,
yes.
Oh my God, immigration rights, there would be, within an hour, probably 500 comments on the Providence Journal website, most of them from people who never identified themselves. So now if you want to post a comment on a story, you actually have to have a Facebook identity so that we can figure out who you are, because that's the problem, with nameless people making pot shots, and most of them are uninformed. So, do we have time for one more question? Or should we stop?
I think I mean, yeah, I think we've had enough questions.
All right. Thank you all for coming.